Suffering and joy, pleasure and sadness, melancholy is a conundrum, a riddle of contradictions. The latent richness of the concept grows out of these paradoxes, and three particular enigmas haunt melancholy: madness, genius, and beauty. Why that being sad mean that you're mad? Why are geniuses and heroes so often melancholy? And how can things that are sorrowful be beautiful? Solaris is a powerful dialogue between something and nothing, a dialogue between presence and absence, and their coexistence in our perception. It is also a powerful dialogue between memory and forgetfulness, preservation and decay. The pain of memory is great, but the pain of forgetting a memory is even greater.
I want to call it off.
While memory can be painful, it can still provide us with a spatial density of what we call our existence. A sense of familiarity, a sense of homeliness, in otherwise unknowable circumstances.
Jag är ovetande.
And when memory is removed, we are instantly transported to an alien world. But memory is going to fade anyway. Forgetfulness, which is the companion of death, is inevitable. So, conquering a new world is a lot like creating works of art, which is an attempt of recreating the past, like building a new house for the same old soul on a different planet. It is also like resurrecting the dead. This is where the present tense is quite often the past tense as well. The present is a copy of the past, like Harry is a copy of Kelvin's real wife, who had died 10 years ago. But thanks to forgetfulness, there is an error in copying. A loss of information has happened during the transfer of perception.
У меня такое чувство, как будто я что-то забыла.
Scientists from Earth came to Solaris to conduct experiments on it, but they themselves ended up being experimented by it. So Harry is not really the materialization of Kelvin's perception, but the perception of planet Solaris based on Kelvin's perception, which makes her a perception of perception. Like the nature of cinema itself, when a film is projected on screen, it's already presented as the perception of its author. But when it's perceived by the audience, it's the perception of a perception. Of course, it's different with each individual spectator, like Tarkovsky himself quoted in his book that a book read by 1,000 different people is 1,000 different books. But as I speak, I can only account for my individual perception as I progress ahead in this essay. And so are you. Now coming back to the topic, Harry undoubtedly is a metaphor for cinema. But Kelvin and the planet Solaris are both the creators and audience at the same time. They create and perceive simultaneously, which also indicates that as spectators, we not only stare into this abyss called cinema, cinema also stares back at us.
L'image, monsieur, seule capable de nier le néant, est aussi le regard du néant sur nous.
But the question is, how often do we get to have that realization while watching a film? Not very often, in fact, unless the self-reflexivity is intentional. In principle, all films are self-reflexive, but only a handful of them care to acknowledge it, whereas most contemporary films desperately run away from it.
Они ее боятся, как огня. Кого?
Their continuous refusal to acknowledge that a film is actually a film, their obsession to represent themselves as a surrogate reality or a rationalist form of realism actually represses the truth that's at the bottom of one's heart. And according to Tarkovsky, the outcome of repression is a lie or pretension, not the truth. Solaris, on the other hand, is a grand gesture of self-reflexivity. It's a powerful dialogue between cinematic liberties and cinematic limitations. The activity of perception which it involves is real, but the perceived is not really the object. It is its shade, its phantom. It's a replica in a new kind of a mirror of a mirror to be precise. Two reflections cancelling out one another, so that cinema can exist on its own, as a null figure, purely zero, like an embodiment of absence, like Harry herself. She can't even have a gender if she is absent. But still it'll be a little insensitive to call her an it, like other crew members of the space station do. They treat her like a thing, so effortlessly objectifying a woman.
Да вы не женщина и не человек, поймите вы наконец, если вы вообще способны что-нибудь понимать.
Why does a null entity has to have the form of a woman? The same question occurred to me when I watched Ghost in the Cell for the first time. Why did the Major had to be a sexy woman and not a man? Part of the answer is to imply that she has no concept of sexuality, hence no concept of gender. And that naiveness or neutrality could have not been perceived if a naked man was to jump out of skyscrapers. Because men do stupid things all the time. So there is a diegesis going on here, which is a bit different than what is being shown to us. And the diegesis is not only of our normal sensory perception upon what we feel when we watch a naked woman, but also about our perception of the same when conditioned with our sociological anecdotes. Tarkovsky was also going for that route. However, the Major is not entirely a null entity like Harry, and neither is Harry unaware of our sexuality. But they do share, along with the replicants of Blade Runner, the sentiments of identity crisis, the ambitions of self-realization, and the temperament of melancholy. Just like human beings.
Но я становлюсь человеком. Чувствую нисколько не меньше, чем вы.
On the other hand, Harry is also quite a bit like a classic movie monster. She is immortal and capable of reviving herself continuously. She is not evil though.
Я совсем себя не знаю.
Also, she doesn't know where she came from.
Не помню.
Her memory is inconsistent.
Я закрываю глаза и уже не могу вспомнить своего лица, а ты?
It jumps forward and backward in time. And at the end, she vanishes away. Isn't that exactly what happens when we watch a film? Cinema is also kind of immortal because it can be replayed again and again. In a film, we never surely know what happened before or what's going to happen after. Time only exists there as an abstract. Passages of time trapped within time itself, just like memories. The cinematic construction itself is breaking the continuity of time, just like Harry's inconsistent memory. And not only with each viewing does a film reveal something new, but also as a cinematic temperament, it has potential to revive itself in the form of memes. And I'm not really talking about the Hollywood remake of Solaris. A remake is automatically haunted by the past. It empties out authorial originality. So if Harry is the remake of an actual human being, then she is bound to be empty of not only the original personality, but also the humane qualities. But does she? There is no simple way to answer this. I mean, if she's fake, can we take her seriously? Can Kelvin take her seriously? If the answer is no, then how do we even take cinema seriously? We do take it seriously, don't we? Despite of knowing that it's just an illusion. And if we know that it's an illusion, then why do we even question the reality behind it? Maybe because moving images resemble so much with our idea of reality that it's almost impossible for us to accept the unreality as unreality and yet take it seriously, which is clearly not the case with other art forms, especially with music. Music as if it exists on a metaphysical plane. Like Stalker says, it's nothing but noises brought to harmony, and yet it's capable of mediating human emotions and expressions.
Что же резонирует у нас в ответ на приведенный к гармонии шум и превращает его для нас в источник высокого наслаждения и объединяет, и потрясает?
We accept the unreality of music with all our seriousness almost immediately without even questioning it. Can we do that for cinema? And that's also the same question that Kelvin is being asked by the planet Solaris. Can he or should he take her seriously? Yes or no, the question again will be on what basis? And what are the consequences? On the course of the film, Harry gets to realize what she really is. A mimioid made from neutrino particles created by planet Solaris and not Kelvin's wife.
Кто это?
And unlike Maul from Inception, Harry is not entirely a product of Kelvin's subconscious. Her physical appearance, her looks, may have come from Kelvin's memories, and her physical presence may have occurred by virtue of this conscious planet. But gradually and eventually, Harry grows to be an individual being of her own, independent of both Kelvin and planet Solaris, who can think for herself, who can make her own decisions and can also act upon them.
Поверьте. Я уже могу обходиться без него.
So, if we are going to take her seriously, then it has to be on the basis of her individuality, and not by the consideration of her being the embodiment of Kelvin's desires. Just like cinema, despite of being a combination/fusion of different art forms, a film is an independent art form in itself. Or is it? Tarkovsky wrote in his book that when people talk about the specific norms of cinema, it is usually in juxtaposition with literature. In my view, it is all important that the interaction between cinema and literature should be explored and exposed as completely as possible so that the two can at least be separated, never to be confused again. Cinema may take dialogue from literature, but that is all. It bears no essential relation to literature whatsoever. What he means by this is that the age-old argument of whether or not a book is better than a film is an invalid one. It's like asking whether a painting is better than a photograph, or if a musical composition is better than a dance performance, or a play for that matter. Simply, a book can do what a film can't, and a film can do what a book can't, because literature uses words to describe the world, whereas film does not have to use words. It manifests itself to us directly. But the manifestation has to have a medium. Different art forms have distinctively different components that become the main element in the construction of the respective art form. And if you remove that component, the art form will cease to exist. For example, the written form is a medium of language. But an audiobook, of course, is different.
I'm still hesitating about returning to Earth, as I still hope, unreasonably, that she might still return. I'm looking at the ocean, begging it.
Here, somebody's tone of voice is what dictates you how to feel, with the aid of a certain language, of course. But primarily, what you experience is not language, but sound waves, just like music. Music doesn't even rely on anything else other than sound. It's the purest of all art forms. Likewise, a painting is made from different shapes, geometric, organic, or both. There you'll also find forms, textures, and patterns, but they are all derivatives of shapes only. And when shapes come together, sometimes they appear to represent something recognizable. We call them images. A photograph is also an image, but essentially it's just captured light, forming different shapes. And finally we have cinema, where we not only get to see the captured light, we also get to hear the recorded sound and get to listen to the composed music. We also encounter language accompanied by the dramaturgy of performance, and many more things. So much so that we hardly recognize cinema for being more than anything else, an art form that mediates itself through time. Time is the main component here, which not to be confused with time duration, but the time within that time duration. You can stare at a painting for 5 minutes or 5 hours, but what you actually do is you examine the construction of shapes and forms and how they evoke you as a whole. Likewise, when you watch a film, regardless of its duration, what you actually do is you examine the construction of passages of time and how they evoke you as a whole. Although every film that has ever been made has dealt with time, but they mostly use it as a tool within which things happen. The time taken to perform an action, for example, then the next action and the next. But that's again time duration we are talking about, not the time in which experiences are imprinted. The image becomes authentically cinematic when not only does it live within time, but time also lives within it. The time duration is nothing but a fracture in current time, or the mathematical time as recorded by a stopwatch, or the real time taken to perform an action. The imprinted time, however, is the layer trapped within the real time, where the irreversible entropy of human emotions are compressed in the form of time. It is also not the abstract perception of time as manipulated by slow motion, fast forward and jump cuts, where external devices are used to transform time visually, but the transformation of time using time itself. If cinema is music, then time is the sound. And if we can think of time in cinema in terms of waves and vibrations, or like physicists, if we can visualize it as a spatial dimension that can alter itself when influenced by the gravity of human emotions, then we can in fact have two different attitudes towards the factual time and the time within time that is cinema. However, it may not be as easy as it sounds, because you can choose not to look at a painting. You can choose not to hear any sound. You can isolate yourself and stop having any linguistic interactions. You can even choose to meditate and stop having linguistic activities in your brain as well. But there is no way you can stop experiencing time, unless you are asleep or unconscious or dead. But again, it's the conscious time that we are talking about. Time just happens to be there by default, which does not have to be the case with cinema, where time doesn't happen by default, but by intention. Even in real life, there are certain occasions where our perception of time gets distorted, when we get indulged in thoughts and imagination, or when we get overwhelmed by certain sensation, feeling, or emotion. And if you notice how often we happen to do so, you'll realize that intellectually we may perceive the factual or the real time, whereas emotionally we perceive a kind of hyper-real time. And cinema tries to emulate that through the concept of imprinted time. In the simplest of analogies, if every breath you take emulates the passing of factual time, then in a state of meditation, the feeling of every conscious breath you take emulates the concept of imprinted time. It's the time that stands out of time. So both filmmakers and audience need to create and perceive cinema in terms of the language of time. Otherwise, cinema is reduced to just an audiovisual medium. Similarly, if we don't account for Harry's individuality, then she is reduced to be a mere fetish or a projection or even inhuman. But cinema reduced of being an audiovisual medium is not as bad as Harry being reduced for objectification. But then it's also not an autonomous art form. It's like reading the translated version of a poem, but in order for you to fully appreciate it, you need to learn the real language. And to your amazement, learning the time language is in fact easier than learning an actual language. And once you learn to read films in the language of time, you'll realize that Tarkovsky was not the first one who tried to do so. There are many filmmakers before and since who have also tried to tackle this idea, but Tarkovsky was the one who really hammered it. However, even if we learn the language of time, like mentioned before, we'll still be questioning the reality behind the illusion. And in order to break out of that confinement, the least what cinema can do is to reveal its true nature, which is unreal. Self-reflexive art comments on its medium, on what art can possibly be. And being self-reflexive doesn't necessarily mean to break the fourth wall, or being straightforward meta-cinematic. And it doesn't have to put itself at its center like a metaphor either, like Harry in Solaris. Yes, it can do all these things if necessary. And if not, then there is this one simple and basic tool that's present in every film, which can be manipulated to achieve this goal, and that is point of view. Most contemporary films are made with a combination of subjective and objective points of views, that is the point of view of a character and the point of view of the audience respectively, achieved through strategic placements of the camera. Sometimes they also use the authorial point of view. It's when the filmmaker takes your attention away from the main action in order for you to look at something else, something specific that the filmmaker wants you to see. It feels as if the filmmaker is present there with you and turning your head with a mild force, not to take you away completely from the main action, but to add an extra layer to it, by asking you to be more attentive, more involved. However, the use of authorial point of view is very subtle in contemporary films, whereas Tarkovsky heavily relies on it.
Когда мы на пейзаж смотрим, просто вот смотрим, смотрим. Но мы еще смотрим, и мы уже что-то ждем. Мы ждем из этого пейзажа что-то, нечто, и начинает напрягаться наше внимание. Это вот сродни медитации как раз. Он мастер в этом. Если мой отец мастер в массовых динамических сценах, которые никто больше в мире так не снимет, как отец, то я думаю, так вот атмосферу понять, как... Вот я вам хочу сказать, тогда реальность становится иным временем, временем искусства.
The form of his films demands more of your attention, and while doing so, you not only get aware of the fact that what you're watching is unreal, you also feel kind of unsettled when you get moved by the kind of cinema that proceeds by intuition and association, unlike the cause and effect narrative of contemporary films. According to Tarkovsky, poetic reasoning is closer to the laws by which thoughts develop than the logic of traditional cinema.
На экран. Думаю, какие интересные корни, какой красивый вид. Я здесь никогда не была. Это я стою. Ой, а где это было? И тут я понимаю, что Андрей Тарковский ему предложил, а Юсов снял так личностно, что я даже не поняла, что я участвовала в этой съемке. Это было другое место, потому что это было подано глазами другого художника. Я его так не увидела. Я не увидела эти корни, я не увидела эту кору, я не увидела своего лица. И вдруг неожиданно это я стою. Вот феномен, потому что каждый художник очень индивидуален.
Through poetic connections, feeling is heightened and the spectator is made more active. He becomes a participant in the process of discovering life, unsupported by ready-made deductions from the plot. Earlier I had mentioned that, in principle, all films are self-reflexive, because cinema has its limitations. You can't look at anything beyond this rectangular diegetic space. And cinema needs to break the continuity of time because it has to be precise, and it can't go on forever. But over the years, with our interaction with cinema, we have come to accept certain things by calling them cinematic reality. And as per Tarkovsky, a distinction has to be made between those natural conditions which are immanent in the nature of a given art form, which defines the difference between real life and the specific limitations of that art form. These limitations are to be treated with grand gestures of acceptance, because despite of them being limitations, they alone define the art form. For example, a painting in a three-dimensional space is not a painting. Likewise, a film that pretends to be real is not a film. It can very well be an aesthetically pleasing motion picture presentation, with a compelling story, brilliant acting, soulful music, and masterful editing. It can have all those things and yet not be a film. You can achieve nothing in art unless you are free from received ideas. You have to work out your own position, your individual point of view. Tarkovsky always wanted to make films, although he was unsure of what role he had to play in the making of a film. Only after the completion of his first feature, Ivan's Childhood, he was ready to accept the role as a director or an author. And thereafter, the author began to develop his authorial point of view, along with the concept of imprinted time. He juggled with these ideas in his next feature, Andrei Rublev, and finally established them in his third feature, that is Solaris. He even declared his accomplishment in the very first scene of his fourth feature film, The Mirror, that after a lot of struggle, he finally was able to find his own voice.
Громко и четко. Я могу говорить. Давай.
Я могу говорить.
The more you get indulged in his work, the more you get to realize that his films can actually think for themselves. That is to say, they are not only extensions of film criticism, they are also textbooks of film theories themselves. There are a number of filmmakers who, in one way or another, have declared themselves to be the disciples of Tarkovsky, who have tried to play with Tarkovskian motifs along with their own, and have kind of revived the Tarkovskian language and have kept it alive in the form of memes. Since we are talking about Solaris in particular, there is this one film that astonishingly revitalizes it. All the ideas related to Solaris that we have discussed by far are present in this film as well. The only difference is that in Solaris the ideas converge into a singular form, Harry, whereas in Cemetery of Splendor the ideas diverge from one another. But they don't go away, you can feel their presence. But the question is, like Tarkovsky films, is this film also capable of removing even the reality out of cinematic reality and become purely cinematic? Sadly, that's a topic for another video essay, so watch out for it. However, there shall be no confusion with how to explore life by removing reality, because apparently being truthful is clearly not the same as being realistic. For Kelvin, Harry is realistic but not real, and yet her conscience is truthful. And that's why she should be taken seriously. And like mentioned before, taking her seriously has consequences as well. We have to deal with the fact that despite of being truthful, she is just an illusion. She can only exist in and around the energy field of planet Solaris that prevents her neutrino particles from disintegrating. Like a film can exist only on a screen. So our intimacy with the moving image, our obsession of questioning the reality behind it, won't take us anywhere. Just the way Kelvin's love for Harry is an impossible one. But Harry also loves Kelvin, doesn't she? Is her love real? Kelvin certainly gets to face a moral dilemma here. But ultimately, it's Harry's individual decision that resolves the conflict. An immortal being sacrifices herself for the sake of mortal beings.
Нет больше Харри.
From this binary state of absent-present, she chooses the state of total absence. Not only to prove that her love was real, but also to emulate that a film has to end as well. And Kelvin's state at this point is like that of a cinephile. In the novel, Kelvin's wife's name was Rhea. If you reverse the syllables, then you get Yari, which kind of sounds like Harry. And that's not the only alteration. In the novel, human sorrow has a minor place, but in the film, it is prominent. Whereas Lem sees man as part of endless universe, Tarkovsky saw the universe in man. Peter Green also adds that Tarkovsky drew strength from belief. In his awareness of the transience of human existence, he was also obsessed with the Promethean idea of reversing the order of things and finding a path to eternal life. Nearly all his films are scenarios of paradise and humanist utopias in one.
Все фильмы Андрея Аркадьевича не только пророческие, но они, к сожалению и к несчастью, пророческие для него самого. И есть такая фраза в фильме «Solaris».
А любишь то, что можно потерять. Себя, женщину, родину.
И на какой-то период он все это потерял и заболел смертельно. Вот ценность для Андрея, видимо, для самого человека был дом, который у него почти никогда не было, уют, который никто ему так и не создал, женщина, та, которая бы его до конца понимала, и родина, которую он очень любил, которая его совершенно не понимала и не принимала, ну, как и всех гениев. И он давно задумал этот побег, когда умерла у него мама, и он не мог на родину вернуться, чтобы ее похоронить. И вот тогда вот эти раковые клетки начали.
It is not surprising why Tarkovsky used similar situations in many of his films, removing his protagonists from their familiar everyday surroundings to an alien ground, battlefield, forbidden zone, exile, or in this case a space station, where he proceeds to hold up a mirror to them and confront them with an unknown image of themselves. Kelvin's human identity is merged with the universe, an image of death and resurrection in which time ceases to exist.
Вот видели, у меня такой инфернальный немножко взгляд в начале. То есть смотрит не Харри, не земной человек ушедший, а через нее смотрит Солярис, космос, Господь Бог, что хотите. Но это вот то самое вишь.
And I'm an atheist myself, so I clearly don't mean that Harry represents God, and I can neither be sure if Tarkovsky had that in his mind or not. But what I'm saying is that cinephilia is a lot like the prayer of an atheist. It may sound silly, but Kelvin's love for Harry is like our impossible desire for cinema. What we desire is contact and communication, but what we get instead is this indifferent solitude. Finally, if you ask me to say 3 words for the film, I would say melancholy, individuality, and cinephilia. Although cinephilia itself is a melancholic temperament, and cinema too strives for individuality, there is no single word that can contain them all, and if there is, then it has to be Solaris. The film isn't really about tragic loss, it's more about the ongoing stream of existential solitude. We are already in a virtual world, so the question of what's real and what's not is an invalid one. Even in reality, if we think we exist, then what? If not, endless waiting.